Adonai sefotai tiftachu fi yadi tehilatecha. Oh Lord, open up my lips that my mouth shall declare thy praise. Some of us grew up singing that before we go into any Amidah, which is our central worship, our central prayer, the Amidah, the standing prayer that is at the heart of every single prayer service. And the rabbis took a verse from Tehillim, from the Psalms, that say first, Adonai sifotai tiftachu fi yagiti latecha. Help open my lips for me so that my mouth can find these words of praise. And it's a beautiful kavanah, beautiful intention that takes us into prayer, where we're asking for help to find the right words to say for our prayers. But if you actually look at that psalm in context, it's quite fascinating. Because after it says that, Adonai sefotai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha, it says, Ki lo tachpat zevach ve'etnei ola lo titzei. Zivchei Elohim ruach nishbara, lev nishba, unetiva Elohim lo tivzech. Which basically means you don't have any need or desire for sacrifices. You don't want burnt offerings. To God, what is an offering if not a broken spirit and a crushed and broken heart? Very different if you take the rest of that psalm into consideration, right? It's not just open my lips so that my mouth can declare your praise, but like, what do these sacrifices mean to you? What does it mean that you smell the smell of burning flesh? What does it mean that that's a reach nichoach? What is a sacrifice? And this is one of many places in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that kind of rail against sacrifices, or seemingly so, right? Many examples. Isaiah, the famous Haftorah that we read on Yom Kippur, or even more so, the Haftorah that we read on Tisha B'Av, the day when we're commemorating the destroyed temples, right? He says, your sacrifices are meaningless to me. I don't want them. And then, of course, famously in Amos, beautiful, beautiful verses in Amos that say, I loathe, I spurn your festivals. I'm not appeased by your assemblies. If you offer me burnt offerings or your meal offering, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gifts or your fatlings. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes. And then, what's the verse after that? Let justice roll like a mighty stream, righteousness, or like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream, right? Vayagel kamayim mishpat utstaka kanachal eten. And that's one of many places where our Nevi'im, our prophetic tradition, basically say, your sacrifices are completely meaningless if you're not acting like a mensch in this world, if you're not just doing acts of justice and mercy and kindness every single day. And this sort of disconnect that I think is as alive today as it ever was, really, between spiritual practice, let's say, in a very broad category, and how we live in the world, how we walk in the world. And very often the two are too disconnected. It's a cognitive dissonance to have a life where you are performing rituals, saying words to prayers, keeping mitzvot even, or if you practice other religions like meditating, if you're cruel and unkind and unjust to others in society. And of course it's all in a balance, because but the things that are done in the name of religion, I think we can all agree, can be pretty horrific and shameful. Whether it's people in our own religion or in other religions, people who on the outside are practicing very devout, religious, pious lives, and then can just cheat people in business or ravage other people's homes and property in the name of some kind of God that I don't really believe in. A God that would be fine with that. Oh, you're saying the right prayers at the right time and you're doing all of these wonderful rituals. It doesn't matter how you are in the world. Of course, none of us believe, I don't think, in a God like that. One of the most extreme examples of that for me was when I was in Ghana in Africa with a group of rabbis through the American Jewish World Service doing a service project in a school that was rehabilitating child slaves. And we went to the Cape Coast where the slave castle, which was the biggest processor of slaves in Africa. And when we saw that slave castle and we saw the conditions and the museum that's been turned into and where the slave ships arrived, and then where the Africans who had in many cases been sold by their own people were chained naked in dungeons, the women's dungeon and the male dungeon. And the male dungeon where there were these naked human beings chained up in their own filth, above that dungeon was a trapdoor, and the trapdoor was in a church. So that the people who were in the business of selling these slaves could, in the middle of their prayers, look down and make sure there was no insurgency or anything happening in the male dungeon. I remember seeing that and just being so horrifically shocked. And then we know there are other examples of it. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel could never get over the fact that some of the Nazis in Auschwitz would go from setting off the gas in the gas chambers to praying a mass in the Catholic Church that was on Auschwitz. Something that Heschel could never get over his whole life, right? There's just a way in which there's just this disconnect between the way we perceive religion to be and what it actually instructs us to do in the world, which is why we need the religion of the prophets, who had such sharp criticism of empty, perfunctory performance of the rituals without actually a sense of justice and compassion and chesed, loving kindness. So what are these sacrifices that we just read about? I was talking a little bit to our guest, Rabbi Arik Asherman, about it. It doesn't mean that the prophets wanted to abolish the sacrificial system. They just wanted to place it into a context. If you are going to have a life that contains spiritual ritual in it, whether it be prayer or some form of sacrifice or meditation or whatever the spiritual practice might be, don't have that spiritual practice be disconnected from your obligations in the world to be a kind and good and just person. It's in some ways a very simple message, maybe even simplistic message. But like the prophets clearly had to say it over and over and over again because they were witnessing corruption on a mighty level. They were witnessing, even during the times of the Second Temple, they were witnessing horrific corruption with the priests. We read this in this beautiful way about the development of this spiritual tradition of the high priest, but the way it went down over the generations. Like anybody in positions of power, it has the potential to be corrupted. And there was a lot of corruption, a lot of cheating, a lot of unkindness. Reb Zalman's translation of Psalms, which some of you may be familiar with this, he translated all 150 Psalms in an edition that he called Psalms in a Translation for Praying. And his translation of that passage that I quoted, which is Psalm 51, the one that has Adonai, Sifotai tiftachu fi yagiti letecha, he says like this: "My very tongue is eager to sing of your fairness. Then your praise will flow from my mouth with ease. If you really wanted sacrifices, I gladly would bring them. But it is not a burnt offering that you want from me. Instead, you favor my humbled spirit, God. My heartbroken regret you will not despise." There's something about the quality of what it means to pray in Judaism. And I fully acknowledge, as someone who loves the tradition and loves traditional liturgy, that there are times where it's just like rote. We're reading through these words, we're singing through these words, we're not really focusing on what the meaning might be or what they are inspiring us actually to do in the world. Heschel says in his magnificent essay called On Prayer, which was in an edition edited by his daughter Susanna Heschel, Dr. Susanna Heschel, with the title Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, which, by the way, and I've talked about it before, was a quote in the telegram that Heschel wrote to J.F. Kennedy talking about the urgency of the civil rights issue. And he said, this is a time of moral This is a time that calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. In that edition that his daughter, Dr. Susanna Heschel, edited, there is an essay on prayer, which is quite a long essay, and it's a beautiful and powerful essay. And some of us are familiar with probably the most famous and overquoted line from it is, prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive. Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive. We've talked before about what subversive prayer might look like. But in that same essay, he says, prayer should be an act of catharsis, of purgation of emotions, as well as a process of self-clarification, of examining priorities, of elucidating responsibility. Prayer not verified by conduct is an act of desecration and blasphemy. I'll read that sentence again. Prayer not verified by conduct is an act of desecration and blasphemy. Do not take a word of prayer in vain. Our deeds must not be a refutation of our prayers. So it's this constant tension, and this is not obviously the first time that I'm talking about this, between having a life where we have a spiritual life, where we delve deeply into the mystery and the power of the traditions of the Jewish people. But at the same time, it's about how we walk in the world. And so when we start this third book of the Torah, Vayikra, which is all about this sacrificial system and this idea that it was where the seeds were planted to create a form of worship that was kind of a mirror of the forms of worship that were happening in the ancient world. That's what people knew. That's how they knew how to worship God, was to bring something of value, something that was part of their household, something that they really cared about. An animal was not just like, something that they found wrapped in plastic in a supermarket shelf. It was actually an animal that they had a relationship with, that they would bring, and they would bring it close. And Korban, as I've already said, which is usually translated as sacrifice, was about bringing that animal close as a way to deepen the relationship that they had with the divine in their ancient understanding. And then after the sacrificial system has not happened for 2,000 years. It disappeared with the destruction of the Second Temple. Although there are some people in the Jewish community, I'm definitely not one of them, who would like to see a restoration of the sacrificial system. Most Jews in the world of all denominations don't want that. And there's a strong recognition that the rabbis said the avoda, the worship of animal sacrifice, becomes avoda shebalev, worship of the heart, spiritual practice. So our sacrifices become our prayers. The altar where the animals were sacrificed is our heart. The altar is also the Shabbat table and the festival table where we gather in sacred community to honor the Sabbath and to honor the festivals, right? And so there's this idea of transformation from an ancient system into one that is much more internal, much more about a life of prayer. And a life of prayer can become as complicated as a life of sacrifice, in the sense that it's very easy to get caught into habitual, what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called religious behaviorism. And I'm certainly, as I've already confessed to you all, I'm certainly liable for that sometimes, of going through periods of religious behaviorism where I'm just going through the motions without really thinking about the impact and the words and how they inspire me to act as best I can in this world, right? And so that's, I think, what the psalm means when it says, like, forget the sacrifices, just let your spirit be crushed by the reality of what it means to be a human being in this world. And through that place of brokenness, like, be the best you can. Or as Leonard Cohen says, of course, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, right? That beautiful and very unfortunately overquoted lyric from Leonard Cohen's song Anthem, but just recognizing everything's imperfect and broken, but that doesn't let us off the hook. It actually gives us more of a sense of responsibility. There are three categories of sacrifice in the Torah. Behema, behema is like an animal, usually a kind of wild animal of some kind. We talk about it in a very disparaging way. It's a behema. It's like a wild beast, But behema is really the types of animal that roam wild. They're not domestic. And then there's the tson, the bakar, which is cattle, and there's tson, which is a flock. And these three categories, a brilliant interpretation from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who says that they each of them represent something that we bring in ourselves. Because there is this Hasidic idea of the nefesh behemit, right? That we all have different levels of soul. There's the Kabbalists say we have 5 levels of soul. Often that's just 3. The nefesh, which is seen as the so-called animal soul. The ruach, which is more like the spirit, which is a source of inspiration and intuition. And then the neshama, which is really the word that is most often translated as soul, which is what connects us to the world beyond ourselves. And then there's 2 higher levels, which we won't get into right now. But the point is that nefesh is often translated as animal soul, based on the idea that animals don't have the capacity to elevate. Now, many of us have, like really, including me, have very close relationships with particular animals, and I think that some of this is based on people who clearly didn't know animals. Like the idea that an animal doesn't have a personality or doesn't have a feelings of loyalty. I mean, especially dogs. I'm biased. I'm not a cat person. But dogs, my dog, like there's something incredibly loving about them. But like in the ancient world, there's this idea that we have an animal soul which we need to refine. We have the capacity to rise above it. So the sacrifices is not just about like, I'm taking an animal and sacrificing. It's about looking inside and seeing which are the parts of myself where I just behave like an animal. Like I'm not thinking deeply about the people around me. I'm just like going on my instincts. I'm hungry, I want to eat. I'm feeling attracted, I want to do that. I want to, attack another dog. I want to do whatever it is I want to do. But there's this sense of like seeing Jewish tradition as a way of refining and elevating that aspect of animal nature, so to speak, right? And then bakar which is translated as cattle, is from the same root as boker, which means morning. And its root meaning of the Hebrew root beit kuf resh is about breaking through. So there's another aspect of sacrifice which is about breaking through. And then the third one, which is son, which is a herd, is about where am I just going like the herd? I'm just behaving like I'm part of the herd. I'm not thinking, I'm not acting in a way that's responsible because I'm just going along with the herd mentality, right? And so those 3 aspects, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, are really, in a sense, part of what the sacrificial system was all about looking at the ways in which I want to rise above my animal nature, about looking at the places that I want to break through, and about looking at the places where I'm just going along with the herd and I actually need to stand up and do something different. So all of that is based on this idea of what the sacrifices may have been one time. But if sacrifices are indeed have been replaced by prayer, what does it mean to have a prayer life that can allow us to do that? There's an incredible statement on this parsha, because I was talking while we were reading the Torah about this idea of reach nichoach l'Hashem, right? The pleasing odor to God, that over and over again in the book of Leviticus, there's this idea that as this animal flesh is being burnt, that somehow the smell is pleasing to God. We talked about a little bit, does God like barbecue? I don't know. But it's if we're not taking smell in a literal sensory sense, right? That Rabbi Shefer Gold says, I love this, can the word of a prayer engage the senses fully? Can we taste it, smell it, touch it, feel its blood, hear its music and the silence within it, witness its passage into the void, see in it the shadow of death and the spark of life? Do we leave our prayer feeling purified, our burdens lifted? Our ancestors celebrated their new state of connection by sharing a sacred meal with the priests and with God. After praying in community, can we also make our celebrations holy? Can we eat these sacred meals, our Kaddish on Egg Shabbat, yes, it's coming, I promise, knowing that each bite of our feast is also tasted and enjoyed by God? It's a really powerful invitation to see, not to separate prayer from action, but to see prayer as something that is so embodied, so visceral, so connected to our senses that it's like we really taste and smell and feel the blood of our prayers. If we have a relationship, and maybe some of us do. I can't claim that I do. I have moments, I think, I hope, I aspire to have moments where my prayer is like that. But if we have a prayer life like that, then that prayer life must touch us in a way that we then act in the world. And so we can be inspired by the prophets, by Amos and by Isaiah and by Jeremiah, who railed against meaningless forms of worship and pleaded us to live lives of justice and compassion and truth. And when I, not to keep going on about it, but when I experience my friend and colleague Rabbi Arik Asherman and the way he walks in the world, deeply committed to his Jewish path of practice and walking every single day of his life, working for justice, it's a symbol of what Judaism in its full power can really be. And so as we read now, as we enter into this third book of Torah, which is about our system of sacrifices and sacrifices related to prayer, I think it's a real invitation, on the one hand, to deepen our spiritual lives and our connection, and to really sort of perhaps redefine our relationship to the words of prayer and to spiritual practice on the one hand, and on the other hand, to allow those practices to inspire us to, in the words of Micah, to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. Shabbat Shalom.